The Adventures of Ferdinand Count Fathom, Chapter 39, Our adventurer is made acquainted with a new scene of life. Just as he entered these mansions of misery, his ears were invaded with a hoarse and dreadful voice, exclaiming, "You, Bess Beadle, score a couple of fresh eggs, a pennyworth of butter, and half a pint of mountain to the king, and stop credit till the bill is paid. He is now debtor for 15 shillings and sixpence, and d—n me if I trust him 1 farthing more, if he was the best king in Christendom. And, d'ye hear, send Ragged Head with 5 pounds of potatoes for Major Macleaver's supper, and let him have what drink he wants. The fat widow gentlewoman from Pimlico has promised to quit his score. Sir Mungo Barebones may have some hasty pudding and small beer, though I don't expect to see his coin, no more than to receive the 18 pence I laid out for a pair of breeches to his backside. What then? He's a quiet sort of a body, and a great scholar, and it was a scandal to the place to see him going about in that naked condition. As for the mad Frenchman with the beard, if you give him so much as a cheese paring, I'll send you back to the hole, among your old companions, an impudent dog. I'll teach him to draw his sword upon the governor of an English county jail." What? I suppose he thought he had to do with a French hang-tang-dang, rabbit him. He shall eat his white feather, before I give him credit for a morsel of bread. Although our adventurer was very little disposed, at this juncture, to make observations foreign to his own affairs, he could not help taking notice of these extraordinary injunctions, especially those concerning the person who was entitled king, whom, however, he supposed to be some prisoner elected as the magistrate by the joint suffrage of his fellows. Having taken possession of his chamber, which he rented at 5 shillings a week, and being ill at ease in his own thoughts, he forthwith secured his door, undressed, and went to bed, in which, though it was none of the most elegant or inviting couches, he enjoyed profound repose after the accumulated fatigues and mortifications of the day. Next morning, after breakfast, the keeper entered his apartment, and gave him to understand, that the gentlemen under his care, having heard of the Count's arrival, had deputed one of their number to wait upon him with the compliments of condolence suitable to the occasion, and invite him to become a member of their society. Our hero could not politely dispense with this instance of civility, and their ambassador being instantly introduced by the name of Captain Minikin, saluted him with great solemnity. This was a person equally remarkable for his extraordinary figure and address. His age seemed to border upon 40, his stature amounted to 5 feet, his visage was long, meagre, and weather-beaten, and his aspect, though not quite rueful, exhibited a certain formality, which was the result of care and conscious importance. He was very little encumbered with flesh and blood, yet what body he had was well proportioned, his limbs were elegantly turned, and by his carriage he was well entitled to that compliment which we pay to any person when we say he has very much the air of a gentleman. There was also an evident singularity in his dress, which, though intended as an improvement, appeared to be an extravagant exaggeration of the mode, and at once evinced him an original to the discerning eyes of our adventurer, who received him with his usual complaisance, and made a very eloquent acknowledgment of the honor and satisfaction he received from the visit of the representative, and the hospitality of his constituents. The captain's peculiarities were not confined to his external appearance, for his voice resembled the sound of a bassoon, or the aggregate hum of a whole beehive, and his discourse was almost nothing else than a series of quotations from the English poets, interlarded with French phrases, which he retained for their significance, on the recommendation of his friends, being himself unacquainted with that or any other outlandish tongue. Fathom, finding this gentleman of a very communicative disposition, thought he could not have a fairer opportunity of learning the history of his fellow prisoners, and, turning the conversation on that subject, was not disappointed in his expectation. "I don't doubt, sir," said he, with the utmost solemnity of declamation, "but you look with horror upon every object that surrounds you in this uncomfortable place. But, nevertheless, here are some, who, as my friend Shakespeare has it, have seen better days, and have with holy bell been knolled to church, and sat at good men's feasts, and wiped their eyes of drops that sacred pity hath engendered. You must know, sir, that, exclusive of the canaille, or the profanum vulgus, as they are styled by Horace, there are several small communities in the jail, consisting of people who are attracted by the manners and dispositions of each other, for this place, sir, is quite a microcosm, and as the great world, so is this, a stage, and all the men and women merely players. For my own part, sir, I have always made it a maxim to associate with the best of company I can find. Not that I pretend to boast of my family or extraction, because, you know, as the poet says, vix ea nostra voco. My father, 'tis true, was a man that piqued himself upon his pedigree, as well as upon his politesse and personal merit, for he had been a very old officer in the army, and I myself may say I was born with a spontoon in my hand. Sir, I have had the honor to serve His Majesty these 20 years, and have been bandied about in the course of duty through all the British plantations, and you see the recompense of all my service. But this is a disagreeable subject, and therefore I shall waive it. However, as Butler observes, my only comfort is, that now my dub-bolt fortune is so low that either it must quickly end, or turn about again and mend. And now, to return from this digression, you will perhaps be surprised to hear that the head or chairman of our club is really a sovereign prince, no less, I'll assure you, than the celebrated Theodore King of Corsica, who lies in prison for a debt of a few £100. Hugh. Quantum mutatis ab illo. It is not my business to censure the conduct of my superiors, but I always speak my mind in a cavalier manner, and as, according to the Spectator, talking to a friend is no more than thinking aloud, entre nous, His Corsican Majesty has been scurvily treated by a certain administration. Be that as it will, he is a personage of a very portly appearance, and is quite master of the bienséance. Besides, they will find it their interest to have recourse again to his alliance, and in that case some of us may expect to profit by his restoration. But few words are best. He that maintains the second rank in our assembly is one Major Macleaver, an Irish gentleman, who has served abroad, a soldier of fortune, sir, a man of unquestionable honor and courage, but a little overbearing, in consequence of his knowledge and experience. He is a person of good address, to be sure, and quite free of the mauvaise honte, and he may have seen a good deal of service. But what then? Other people may be as good as he, though they have not had such opportunities. If he speaks 5 or 6 languages, he does not pretend to any taste in the liberal arts, which are the criterion of an accomplished gentleman. The next is Sir Mungo Barebones, the representative of a very ancient family in the north. His affairs are very much deranged, but he is a gentleman of great probity and learning, and at present engaged in a very grand scheme, which, if he can bring it to bear, will render him famous to all posterity, no less than the conversion of the Jews and the Gentiles. The project, I own, looks chimerical to one who has not conversed with the author, but, in my opinion, he has clearly demonstrated, from an anagrammatical analysis of a certain Hebrew word, that His present Majesty, whom God preserve, is the person pointed at in Scripture as the temporal Messiah of the Jews, and, if he could once raise by subscription such a trifling sum as £1,200,000, I make no doubt but he would accomplish his aim, vast and romantic as it seems to be. Besides these, we have another messmate, who is a French chevalier, an odd sort of a man, a kind of Lazarillo de Tormes, a caricatura. He wears a long beard, pretends to be a great poet, and makes a ed fracas with his verses. The king has been obliged to exert his authority over him more than once, by ordering him into close confinement, for which he was so rash as to send His Majesty a challenge, but he afterwards made his submission, and was again taken into favor. The truth is, I believe his brain is a little disordered, and, he being a stranger, we overlook his extravagancies. Sir, we shall think ourselves happy in your accession to our society. You will be under no sort of restraint, for, though we dine at one table, every individual calls and pays for his own mess. Our conversation, such as it is, will not, I hope, be disagreeable, and though we have not opportunities of breathing the pure Arcadian air, and cannot, under the shade of melancholy boughs, lose and neglect the creeping hours of time, we may enjoy ourselves over a glass of punch or a dish of tea. Nor are we destitute of friends, who visit us in these shades of distress. The Major has a numerous acquaintance of both sexes, among others, a first cousin of good fortune, who, with her daughters, often cheer our solitude. She is a very sensible ladylike gentlewoman, and the young ladies have a certain dégagé air, that plainly shows they have seen the best company. Besides, I will venture to recommend Mrs. Minikin as a woman of tolerable breeding and capacity, who, I hope, will not be found altogether deficient in the accomplishments of the sex. So that we find means to make little parties, in which the time glides away insensibly. Then I have a small collection of books which are at your service. You may amuse yourself with Shakespeare, or Milton, or Don Quixote, or any of our modern authors that are worth reading, such as The Adventures of Loveville, Lady Frail, George Edwards, Joe Thompson, Bampfylde Moore Carew, Young Scarra, and Miss Betsy Thoughtless, and if you have a taste for drawing, I can entertain you with a parcel of prints by the best masters. A man of our hero's politeness could not help expressing himself in the warmest terms of gratitude for this courteous declaration. He thanked the captain in particular for his obliging offers, and begged he would be so good as to present his respects to the society, of which he longed to be a member. It was determined, therefore, that Minikin should return in an hour, when the count would be dressed, in order to conduct him into the presence of his majesty, and he had already taken his leave for the present, when all of a sudden he came back, and taking hold of a waistcoat that lay upon a chair, "Sir," said he, "give me leave to look at that fringe. I think it is the most elegant knitting I ever saw. But pray, sir, are not these quite out of fashion? I thought plain silk, such as this that I wear, had been the mode, with the pockets very low." Before Fathom had time to make any sort of reply, he took notice of his hat and pumps, the first of which, he said, was too narrow in the brims, and the last an inch too low in the heels. Indeed, they formed a remarkable contrast with his own, for, exclusive of the fashion of the cock, which resembled the form of a Roman galley, the brim of his hat, if properly spread, would have projected a shade sufficient to shelter a whole file of musketeers from the heat of a summer's sun, and the heels of his shoes were so high as to raise his feet 3 inches at least from the surface of the earth. Having made these observations, for the credit of his taste, he retired, and returning at the time appointed, accompanied Ferdinand to the apartment of the king, at the doors of which their ears were invaded with a strange sound, being that of a human voice imitating the noise of a drum. The captain, hearing this alarm, made a full stop, and, giving the count to understand that his majesty was busy, begged he would not take it amiss, if the introduction should be delayed for a few moments. Fathom, curious to know the meaning of what he had heard, applied to his guide for information, and learned that the king and the major, whom he had nominated to the post of his general-in-chief, were employed in landing troops upon the Genoese territory, that is, that they were settling beforehand the manner of their disembarkation. He then, by the direction of his conductor, reconnoitred them through the keyhole, and perceived the sovereign and his minister sitting on opposite sides of a deal board table, covered with a large chart or map, upon which he saw a great number of mussel and oyster shells ranged in a certain order, and, at a little distance, several regular squares and columns made of cards cut in small pieces. The prince himself, whose eyes were reinforced by spectacles, surveyed this armament with great attention, while the general put the whole in action, and conducted their motions by beat of drum. The mussel shells, according to Minikin's explanation, represented the transports, the oyster shells were considered as the men of war that covered the troops in landing, and the pieces of card exhibited the different bodies into which the army was formed upon its disembarkation. As an affair of such consequence could not be transacted without opposition, they had provided diverse ambuscades, consisting of the enemy, whom they represented by grey peas, and accordingly General Macleaver, perceiving the said grey peas marching along shore to attack his forces before they could be drawn up in battalia, thus addressed himself to the oyster shells, in an audible voice: "You men of war, don't you see the front of the enemy advancing, and the rest of the detachment following? Out of sight. Arrah! The devil burn you, why don't you come ashore and open your batteries?" So saying, he pushed the shells towards the breach, performed the cannonading with his voice. The grey peas were soon put in confusion, the general was beat, the cards marched forwards in order of battle, and the enemy having retreated with great precipitation, they took possession of their ground without farther difficulty. Chapter 40, He contemplates majesty and its satellites in eclipse. This expedition being happily finished, General Macleaver put the whole army, navy, transports, and scene of action into a canvas bag. The prince unsaddled his nose, and Captain Minikin being admitted, our hero was introduced in form. Very gracious was the reception he met with from His Majesty, who, with a most princely demeanor, welcomed him to court, and even seated him on his right hand, in token of particular regard. True it is, this presence-chamber was not so superb, nor the appearance of the king so magnificent, as to render such an honor intoxicating to any person of our hero's coolness and discretion. In lieu of tapestry, the apartment was hung with halfpenny ballads, a truckle bed without curtains supplied the place of a canopy, and instead of a crown His Majesty wore a woolen nightcap. Yet, in spite of these disadvantages, there was an air of dignity in his deportment, and a nice physiognomist would have perceived something majestic in the features of his countenance. He was certainly a personage of very prepossessing mien, his manners were engaging, his conversation agreeable, and any man whose heart was subject to the meltings of humanity would have deplored his distress, and looked upon him as a most pathetic instance of that miserable reverse to which all human grandeur is exposed. His fall was even greater than that of Belisarius, who, after having obtained many glorious victories over the enemies of his country, is said to have been reduced to such extremity of indigence, that, in his old age, when he was deprived of his eyesight, he sat upon the highway like a common mendicant, imploring the charity of passengers in the piteous exclamation of Date obolum Belisario, that is, spare a farthing to your poor old soldier Belisarius. I say, this general's disgrace was not so remarkable as that of Theodore, because he was the servant of Justinian, consequently his fortune depended upon the nod of that emperor, whereas the other actually possessed the throne of sovereignty by the best of all titles, namely, the unanimous election of the people over whom he reigned, and attracted the eyes of all Europe, by the efforts he made in breaking the bands of oppression, and vindicating that liberty which is the birthright of man. The English of former days, alike renowned for generosity and valor, treated those hostile princes, whose fate it was to wear their chains, with such delicacy of benevolence, as even dispelled the horrors of captivity, but their posterity of this refined age feel no compunction at seeing an unfortunate monarch, their former friend, ally, and partisan, languish amidst the miseries of a loathsome jail, for a paltry debt contracted in their own service. But, moralising apart, our hero had not long conversed with this extraordinary debtor, who in his present condition assumed no other title than that of baron, than he perceived in him a spirit of quixotism, which all his experience, together with the vicissitudes of his fortune, had not been able to overcome. Not that his ideas soared to such a pitch of extravagant hope as that which took possession of his messmates, who frequently quarrelled one with another about the degrees of favour to which they should be entitled after the king's restoration, but he firmly believed that affairs would speedily take such a turn in Italy, as would point out to the English court the expediency of employing him again, and his persuasion seemed to support him against every species of poverty and mortification. While they were busy in trimming the balance of power on the other side of the Alps, their deliberations were interrupted by the arrival of a scullion, who came to receive their orders touching the bill of fare for dinner, and His Majesty found much more difficulty in settling this important concern, than in compromising all the differences between the Emperor and the Queen of Spain. At length, however, General Macleaver undertook the office of purveyor for his prince. Captain Minikin insisted upon treating the Count, and in a little time the table was covered with a cloth, which, for the sake of my delicate readers, I will not attempt to describe. At this period they were joined by Sir Mungo Barebones, who, having found means to purchase a couple of mutton chops, had cooked a mess of broth, which he now brought in a saucepan to the general rendezvous. This was the most remarkable object which had hitherto presented itself to the eyes of Fathom. Being naturally of a meagre habit, he was, by indigence and hard study, wore almost to the bone, and so bended towards the earth, that in walking his body described at least 150 degrees of a circle. The want of stockings and shoes he supplied with a jockey-straight boot and an half-jack. His thighs and middle were cased in a monstrous pair of brown trunk breeches, which the keeper bought for his use from the executor of a Dutch seaman who had lately died in the jail. His shirt retained no signs of its original color, his body was shrouded in an old greasy tattered plaid nightgown, a blue and white handkerchief surrounded his head, and his looks betokened that immense load of care which he had voluntarily incurred for the eternal salvation of sinners. Yet this figure, uncouth as it was, made his compliments to our adventurer in terms of the most elegant address, and, in the course of conversation, disclosed a great fund of valuable knowledge. He had appeared in the great world, and borne diverse offices of dignity and trust with universal applause. His courage was undoubted, his morals were unimpeached, and his person held in great veneration and esteem, when his evil genius engaged him in the study of Hebrew, and the mysteries of the Jewish religion, which fairly disordered his brain, and rendered him incapable of managing his temporal affairs. When he ought to have been employed in the functions of his post, he was always wrapped in visionary conferences with Moses on the Mount. Rather than regulate the economy of his household, he chose to exert his endeavors in settling the precise meaning of the word Elohim, and having discovered that now the period was come, when the Jews and Gentiles would be converted, he postponed every other consideration, in order to facilitate that great and glorious event. By this time Ferdinand had seen every member of the club, except the French chevalier, who seemed to be quite neglected by the society, for his name was not once mentioned during this communication, and they sat down to dinner, without asking whether he was dead or alive. The king regaled himself with a plate of ox cheek, the major, who complained that his appetite had forsaken him, amused himself with some 40 hard eggs, malaxed with salt butter, the knight indulged upon his soup and bouillie, and the captain entertained our adventurer with a neck of veal roasted with potatoes, but before Fathom could make use of his knife and fork, he was summoned to the door, where he found the chevalier in great agitation, his eyes sparkling like coals of fire. Our hero was not a little surprised at this apparition, who, having asked pardon for the freedom he had used, observed, that, understanding the count was a foreigner, he could not dispense with appealing to him concerning an outrage he had suffered from the keeper, who, without any regard to his rank or misfortunes, had been base enough to refuse him credit for a few necessaries, until he could have a remittance from his steward in France. He therefore conjured Count Fathom, as a stranger and nobleman like himself, to be the messenger of defiance, which he resolved to send to that brutal jailer, that, for the future, he might learn to make proper distinctions in the exercise of his function. Fathom, who had no inclination to offend this choleric Frenchman, assured him that he might depend upon his friendship, and, in the meantime, prevailed upon him to accept of a small supply, in consequence of which he procured a pound of sausages, and joined the rest of the company without delay, making a very suitable addition to such an assemblage of rarities. Though his age did not exceed 30 years, his beard, which was of a brindled hue, flowed down, like Aaron's, to his middle. Upon his legs he wore red stockings rolled up over the joint of the knee, his breeches were of blue drab, with vellum buttonholes, and garters of gold lace, his waistcoat of scarlet, his coat of rusty black cloth, his hair, twisted into a ramly, hung down to his rump, of the color of jet, and his hat was adorned with a white feather. This original had formed many ingenious schemes to increase the glory and grandeur of France, but was discouraged by Cardinal Fleury, who, in all appearance, jealous of his great talents, not only rejected his projects, but even sent him to prison, on pretense of being offended at his impertinence. Perceiving that, like the prophet, he had no honor in his own country, he no sooner obtained his release, than he retired to England, where he was prompted by his philanthropy to propose an expedient to our ministry, which would have saved a vast effusion of blood and treasure. This was an agreement between the Queen of Hungary and the late Emperor, to decide their pretensions by a single combat, in which case he offered himself as the Bavarian champion, but in this endeavor he also proved unsuccessful. Then turning his attention to the delights of poetry, he became so enamored of the muse, that he neglected every other consideration, and she as usual gradually conducted him to the author's never-failing goal, a place of rest appointed for all those sinners whom the profane love of poesy hath led astray. Chapter 41. One quarrel is compromised, and another decided by unusual arms. Among other topics of conversation that were discussed at this genial meeting, Sir Mungo's scheme was brought upon the carpet by His Majesty, who was graciously pleased to ask how his subscription filled. To this interrogation the knight answered, that he met with great opposition from a spirit of levity and self-conceit, which seemed to prevail in this generation, but that no difficulties should discourage him from persevering in his duty, and he trusted in God, that, in a very little time, he should be able to confute and overthrow the false philosophy of the moderns, and to restore the writings of Moses to that preeminence and veneration which is due to an inspired author. He spoke of the immortal Newton with infinite contempt, and undertook to extract from the Pentateuch a system of chronology which would ascertain the progress of time since the fourth day of the creation to the present hour, with such exactness, that not one vibration of a pendulum should be lost. Nay, he affirmed that the perfection of all arts and sciences might be attained by studying these secret memoirs, and that he himself did not despair of learning from them the art of transmuting baser metals into gold. The Chevalier, though he did not pretend to contradict these assertions, was too much attached to his own religion to acquiesce in the knight's project of converting the Jews and the Gentiles to the Protestant heresy, which, he said, God Almighty would never suffer to triumph over the interests of his own holy Catholic Church. This objection produced abundance of altercation between two very unequal disputants, and the Frenchman, finding himself puzzled by the learning of his antagonist, had recourse to the argumentum ad hominem, by laying his hand upon his sword, and declaring that he was ready to lose the last drop of his blood in opposition to such a damnable scheme. Sir Mungo, though in all appearance reduced to the last stage of animal existence, no sooner heard this epithet applied to his plan, than his eyes gleamed like lightning, he sprung from his seat with the agility of a grasshopper, and, darting himself out at the door like an arrow from a bow, reappeared in a moment with a long rusty weapon, which might have been shown among a collection of rarities as the sword of Guy Earl of Warwick. This implement he brandished over the Chevalier's head with the dexterity of an old prize-fighter, exclaiming, in the French language, "Thou art a profane wretch marked out for the vengeance of heaven, whose unworthy minister I am, and here thou shalt fall by the sword of the Lord and of Gideon." The Chevalier, unterrified by this dreadful salutation, desired he would accompany him to a more convenient place, and the world might have been deprived of one or both these knights-errant, had not General Macleaver, at the desire of His Majesty, interposed, and found means to bring matters to an accommodation. In the afternoon the society was visited by the Major's cousin and her daughters, who no sooner appeared than they were recognized by our adventurer, and his acquaintance with them renewed in such a manner as alarmed the delicacy of Captain Minikin, who in the evening repaired to the Count's apartment, and with a formal physiognomy, accosted him in these words: "Sir, I beg pardon for this intrusion, but I come to consult you about an affair in which my honor is concerned, and a soldier without honor, you know, is no better than a body without a soul. I have always admired that speech of Hotspur in the first part of Henry IV, by heaven, methinks it were an easy leap to pluck bright honor from the pale facete moon, or dive into the bottom of the deep, where Fathom line could never touch the ground, and pluck up drowned honor by the locks. There is a boldness and ease in the expression, and the images are very picturesque. But, without any further preamble, pray, sir, give me leave to ask how long you have been acquainted with those ladies who drank tea with us this afternoon. You'll forgive the question, sir, when I tell you that Major Macleaver introduced Mrs. Minikin to them as to ladies of character, and, I don't know how, sir, I have a sort of presentiment that my wife has been imposed upon. Perhaps I may be mistaken, and God grant I may. But there was a je ne sais quoi in their behavior today, which begins to alarm my suspicion. Sir, I have nothing but my reputation to depend upon, and I hope you will excuse me, when I earnestly beg to know what rank they maintain in life." Fathom, without minding the consequence, told him, with a simper, that he knew them to be very good-natured ladies, who devoted themselves to the happiness of mankind. This explanation had no sooner escaped from his lips, than the captain's face began to glow with indignation, his eyes seemed bursting from their spheres, he swelled to twice his natural dimensions, and, raising himself on his tiptoes, pronounced, in a strain that emulated thunder, "Blood. Sir, you seem to make very light of the matter, but it is no joke to me. I'll assure you, and Macleaver shall see that I am not to be affronted with impunity. Sir, I shall take it as a singular favour if you will be the bearer of a billet to him, which I shall write in 3 words. Nay, sir, you must give me leave to insist upon it, as you are the only gentleman of our mess whom I can entrust with an affair of this nature. Fathom, rather than run the risk of disobliging such a punctilious warrior, after having in vain attempted to dissuade him from his purpose, undertook to carry the challenge, which was immediately penned in these words, Sir. You have violated my honour in imposing upon Mrs. Minikin your pretended cousins as ladies of virtue and reputation. I therefore demand such satisfaction as a soldier ought to receive, and expect you will adjust with my friend Count Fathom the terms upon which you shall be met by the much injured Goliah Minikin. This morceau being sealed and directed, was forthwith carried by our adventurer to the lodgings of the Major, who had by this time retired to rest, but hearing the Count's voice, he got up and opened the door in cuerpo, to the astonishment of Ferdinand, who had never before seen such an Herculean figure. He made an apology for receiving the Count in his birthday suit, to which he said he was reduced by the heat of his constitution, though he might have assigned a more adequate cause, by owning that his shirt was in the hands of his washerwoman, then shrouding himself in a blanket, desired to know what had procured him the honour of such an extraordinary visit. He read the letter with great composure, like a man accustomed to such intercourse, then addressing himself to the bearer, I will be after diverting the gentleman, said he, in any manner he shall think proper, but, by Jesus, this is no place for such amusements, because, as you well know, my dear Count, if both should be killed by the chance of war, neither of us will be able to escape, and after the breath is out of his body, he will make but a sorry excuse to his family and friends. But that is no concern of mine, and therefore I am ready to please him in his own way. Fathom approved of his remarks, which he reinforced with sundry considerations, to the same purpose, and begged the assistance of the Major's advice, in finding some expedient to terminate the affair without bloodshed, that no troublesome consequences might ensue either to him or to his antagonist, who, in spite of this overstraining formality, seemed to be a person of worth and good nature. With all my heart, said the generous Hibernian, I have a great regard for the little man, and my own character is not to seek at this time of day. I have served a long apprenticeship to fighting, as this same carcass can testify, and if he compels me to run him through the body, by my shoul, I shall do it in a friendly manner. So saying, he threw aside the blanket, and displayed scars and seams innumerable upon his body, which appeared like an old patched leathern doublet. I remember, proceeded this champion, when I was a slave at Algiers, Murphy Macmorris and I happened to have some difference in the bagnio, upon which he bade me turn out. Ara, for what? Said I, here are no weapons that a gentleman can use, and you would not be such a negro as to box like an English carman. After he had puzzled himself for some time, he proposed that we should retire into a corner, and funk one another with brimstone, till one of us should give out. Accordingly we crammed 6 tobacco pipes with sulphur, and, setting foot to foot, began to smoke, and kept a constant fire, until Macmorris dropped down. Then I threw away my pipe, and taking poor Murphy in my arms, What, are you dead? Said I. If you are dead, speak. No, by Jesus, cried he, I ain't dead, but I'm speechless. So he owned I had obtained the victory, and we were as good friends as ever. Now, if Mr. Minikin thinks proper to put the affair upon the same issue, I will smoke a pipe of brimstone with him tomorrow morning, and if I cry out first, I will be after asking pardon for this supposed affront. Fathom could not help laughing at the proposal, to which, however, he objected on account of Minikin's delicate constitution, which might suffer more detriment from breathing in an atmosphere of sulphur than from the discharge of a pistol, or the thrust of a small sword. He therefore suggested another expedient in lieu of the sulphur, namely, the gum called asafoetida, which, though abundantly nauseous, could have no effect upon the infirm texture of the lieutenant's lungs. This hint being relished by the Major, our adventurer returned to his principal, and having repeated the other's arguments against the use of mortal instruments, described the succedaneum which he had concerted with Macleaver. The captain at first believed the scheme was calculated for subjecting him to the ridicule of his fellow prisoners, and began to storm with great violence, but, by the assurances and address of Fathom, he was at length reconciled to the plan, and preparations were made on each side for this duel, which was actually smoked next day, about noon, in a small closet, detached from the challenger's apartment, and within hearing of his Majesty, and all his court, assembled as witnesses and umpires of the contest. The combatants, being locked up together, began to ply their engines with great fury, and it was not long before Captain Minikin perceived he had a manifest advantage over his antagonist. For his organs were familiarized to the effluvia of this drug, which he had frequently used in the course of an hypochondriac disorder, whereas Macleaver, who was a stranger to all sorts of medicine, by his wry faces and attempts to puke, expressed the utmost abhorrence of the smell that invaded his nostrils. Nevertheless, resolved to hold out to the last extremity, he continued in action until the closet was filled with such an intolerable vapor as discomposed the whole economy of his entrails, and compelled him to disgorge his breakfast in the face of his opponent, whose nerves were so disconcerted by this disagreeable and unforeseen discharge, that he fell back into his chair in a swoon, and the Major bellowed aloud for assistance. The door being opened, he ran directly to the window, to inhale the fresh air, while the captain, recovering from his fit, complained of Macleaver's unfair proceeding, and demanded justice of the arbitrators, who decided in his favor, and the Major being prevailed upon to ask pardon for having introduced Mrs. Minikin to women of rotten reputation, the parties were reconciled to each other, and peace and concord re-established in the mess. Fathom acquired universal applause for his discreet and humane conduct upon this occasion, and that same afternoon had an opportunity of seeing the lady in whose cause he had exerted himself. He was presented to her as the husband's particular friend, and when she understood how much she was indebted to his care and concern for the captain's safety, she treated him with uncommon marks of distinction, and he found her a genteel, well-bred woman, not without a good deal of personal charms, and a well-cultivated understanding. Chapter 42, An Unexpected Rencontre, and a Happy Revolution in the Affairs of Our Adventurer. As she did not lodge within the precincts of this garrison, she was one day, after tea, conducted to the gate by the captain and the count, and just as they approached the turnkey's lodge, our hero's eyes were struck with the apparition of his old companion Rinaldo, son of his benefactor and patron, the Count de Melville. What were the emotions of his soul, when he saw that young gentleman enter the prison, and advance towards him, after having spoke to the jailer. He never doubted that, being informed of his confinement, he was come to upbraid him with his villainy and ingratitude, and he in vain endeavored to recollect himself from that terror and guilty confusion which his appearance had inspired, when the stranger, lifting up his eyes, started back with signs of extreme amazement, and, after a considerable pause, exclaimed, "Heaven and earth! Sure my eyes do not deceive me. Is not your name Fathom?" "It is, it must be my old friend and companion, the loss of whom I have so long regretted." With these words he ran towards our adventurer, and, while he clasped him in his arms with all the eagerness of affection, protested that this was one of the happiest days he had ever seen. Ferdinand, who, from this salutation, concluded himself still in possession of Rinaldo's good opinion, was not deficient in expressions of tenderness and joy. He returned his embraces with equal ardor, the tears trickled down his cheeks, and that perturbation which proceeded from conscious perfidy and fear, was mistaken by the unsuspecting Hungarian for the sheer effects of love, gratitude, and surprise. These first transports having subsided, they adjourned to the lodgings of Fathom, who soon recollected his spirits and invention so well as to amuse the other with a feigned tale of his having been taken by the French, sent prisoner into Champagne, from whence he had written many letters to Count Melville and his son, of whom he could hear no tidings, of his having contracted an intimacy with a young nobleman of France, who died in the flower of his age, after having, in token of his friendship, bequeathed to him a considerable legacy. By this he had been enabled to visit the land of his forefathers in the character of a gentleman, which he had supported with some figure, until he was betrayed into a misfortune that exhausted his funds, and drove him to the spot where he was now found. And he solemnly declared, that, far from forgetting the obligation he owed to Count Melville, or renouncing the friendship of Rinaldo, he had actually resolved to set out for Germany on his return to the house of his patron in the beginning of the week posterior to that in which he had been arrested. Young Melville, whose own heart had never known the instigations of fraud, implicitly believed the story and protestations of Fathom, and though he would not justify that part of his conduct by which the term of his good fortune was abridged, he could not help excusing an indiscretion into which he had been hurried by the precipitancy of youth, and the allurements of an artful woman. Nay, with the utmost warmth of friendship, he undertook to wait upon Trapwell, and endeavor to soften him into some reasonable terms of composition. Fathom seemed to be quite overwhelmed with a deep sense of all this goodness, and affected the most eager impatience to know the particulars of Rinaldo's fate, since their unhappy separation, more especially his errand to this uncomfortable place, which he should henceforth revere as the providential scene of their reunion. Nor did he forget to inquire, in the most affectionate and dutiful manner, about the situation of his noble parents and amiable sister. At mention of these names, Rinaldo, fetching a deep sigh, "Alas! My friend," said he, "the Count is no more, and, what aggravates my affliction for the loss of such a father, it was my misfortune to be under his displeasure at the time of his death. Had I been present on that melancholy occasion, so well I knew his generosity and paternal tenderness, that, sure I am, he would in his last moments have forgiven an only son, whose life had been a continual effort to render himself worthy of such a parent, and whose crime was no other than an honorable passion for the most meritorious of her sex. But I was removed at a fatal distance from him, and doubtless my conduct must have been invidiously misrepresented. Be that as it will, my mother has again given her hand in wedlock to Count Trebesi, by whom I have the mortification to be informed that I am totally excluded from my father's succession, and I learn from other quarters, that my sister is barbarously treated by this inhuman father-in-law. Grant, Heaven, I may soon have an opportunity of expostulating with the tyrant upon that subject." So saying, his cheeks glowed, and his eyes lightened with resentment. Then he thus proceeded, "My coming hither today was with a view to visit a poor female relation, from whom I yesterday received a letter, describing her most deplorable situation, and soliciting my assistance, but the turnkey affirms that there is no such person in the jail, and I was on my way to consult the keeper, when I was agreeably surprised with the sight of my dear Fathom." Our adventurer, having wiped from his eyes the tears which were produced by the news of his worthy patron's death, desired to know the name of that afflicted prisoner, in whose behalf he interested himself so much, and Rinaldo produced the letter, subscribed, "Your unfortunate cousin, Helen Melville." This pretended relation, after having explained the degree of consanguinity which she and the Count stood in to each other, and occasionally mentioned some anecdotes of the family in Scotland, gave him to understand that she had married a merchant of London, who, by repeated losses in trade, had been reduced to indigence, and afterwards confined to prison, where he then lay a breathless corpse, having left her in the utmost extremity of wretchedness and want, with 2 young children in the smallpox, and an incurable cancer in one of her own breasts. Indeed, the picture she drew was so moving, and her expressions so sensibly pathetic, that no person, whose heart was not altogether callous, could peruse it without emotion. Rinaldo had sent 2 guineas by the messenger, whom she had represented as a trusty servant, whose fidelity had been proof against all the distress of her mistress, and he was now arrived in order to reinforce his bounty. Fathom, in the consciousness of his own practices, immediately comprehended the scheme of this letter, and confidently assured him that no such person resided in the prison or in any other place. And when his friend applied for information to the keeper, these assurances were confirmed, and that stern janitor told him he had been imposed upon by a stale trick, which was often practiced upon strangers by a set of sharpers, who make it their business to pick up hints of intelligence relating to private families, upon which they build such superstructures of fraud and imposition. However piqued the young Hungarian might be to find himself duped in this manner, he rejoiced at the occasion which had thrown Fathom in his way, and, after having made him a tender of his purse, took his leave, on purpose to wait upon Trapwell, who was not quite so untractable as an enraged cuckold commonly is, for, by this time, he had accomplished the best part of his aim, which was to be divorced from his wife, and was fully convinced that the defendant was no more than a needy adventurer, who, in all probability, would be released by an act of Parliament for the benefit of insolvent debtors, in which case, he, the plaintiff, would reap no solid advantage from his imprisonment. He, therefore, listened to the remonstrances of the mediator, and, after much canvassing, agreed to discharge the defendant, in consideration of £200, which were immediately paid by Count Melville, who, by this deduction, was reduced to somewhat less than 30. Nevertheless, he cheerfully beggared himself in behalf of his friend, for whose release he forthwith obtained an order, and, next day, our adventurer, having bid a formal adieu to his fellows in distress, and, in particular, to his Majesty, for whose restoration his prayers were preferred, he quitted the jail, and accompanied his deliverer, with all the outward marks of unutterable gratitude and esteem. Surely, if his heart had been made of penetrable stuff, it would have been touched by the circumstances of this redemption, but had not his soul been invincible to all such attacks, these memoirs would possibly never have seen the light. When they arrived at Rinaldo's lodgings, that young gentleman honored him with other proofs of confidence and friendship, by giving him a circumstantial detail of all the adventures in which he had been engaged after Fathom's desertion from the imperial camp. He told him, that, immediately after the war was finished, his father had pressed him to a very advantageous match, with which he would have complied, though his heart was not at all concerned, had not he been inflamed with the desire of seeing the world before he could take any step towards a settlement for life. That he had signified his sentiments on this head to the Count, who opposed them with unusual obstinacy, as productive of a delay which might be fatal to his proposal, for which reason he had retired incognito from his family, and travelled through sundry states and countries, in a disguise by which he eluded the inquiries of his parents. That, in the course of these peregrinations, he was captivated by the irresistible charms of a young lady, on whose heart he had the good fortune to make a tender impression. That their mutual love had subjected both to many dangers and difficulties, during which they suffered a cruel separation, after the torments of which, he had happily found her in England, where she now lived entirely cut off from her native country and connections, and destitute of every other resource but his honor, love, and protection. And, finally, that he was determined to combat his own desires, how violent soever they might be, until he should have made some suitable provision for the consequences of a stricter union with the mistress of his soul, that he might not, by a precipitate marriage, ruin the person whom he adored. This end he proposed to attain, by an application to the court of Vienna, which he did not doubt would have some regard to his own service, and that of his father, and thither he resolved to repair, with the first opportunity, now that he had found a friend with whom he could entrust the inestimable jewel of his heart. He likewise gave our hero to understand, that he had been 8 months in England, during which he had lived in a frugal manner, that he might not unnecessarily exhaust the money he had been able to raise upon his own credit, that, hitherto, he had been obliged to defer his departure for Germany on account of his attendance upon the mother of his mistress, who was lately dead of sorrow and chagrin, and that, since he resided in London, he had often heard of the celebrated Count Fathom, though he never imagined that his friend Ferdinand could be distinguished by that appellation.